What would you do if the people who gave you life tried to take it away? Imagine waking up one morning, thinking your family is safe, thinking your life is ordinary, only to realize that the ones who loved you the most could also be the ones who might destroy you. This is not a Hollywood thriller made for the big screen. This is real, and it's horrifying. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. A week before their deaths, Rob Reiner, an icon whose name has graced stages, screens, and awards ceremonies for decades, made a confession. Not to the world, not to the press, but to a friend, a close friend, someone he trusted above all others, Billy Crystal. The kind of friend you expect to hold your secrets, the kind who you believe can shoulder burdens that no one else should carry. What Rob revealed in that conversation would shake the foundations of everything anyone thought they knew about his life, his family, and the shadow that lurked behind the glossy, golden facade of his home. The stage was set in Brentwood, in a $13.5 million estate with manicured lawns, a guest house tucked neatly into the corner, and a veneer of perfection. On the surface, it was everything a Hollywood family could dream of: wealth, fame, and an air of untouchable safety. But appearances can be deceiving. Behind the walls of that mansion, behind the polite smiles and elegant dinner parties, a hidden darkness had been building for decades. And by the time the world would learn the truth, it would be too late. Rob Reiner, 78, and Michelle Reiner, 70, were found stabbed to death on a Sunday evening. Their son, Nick Reiner, 32, who lived in the guest house on the same property, was arrested that very night. Charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, the public was left reeling, struggling to reconcile the picture-perfect life they had seen on television and in magazines with the horrifying reality that had erupted in their backyard. But even amid this shock, there were deeper, more disturbing questions. What had led Nick to allegedly commit such an unthinkable act? How could the son of 2 devoted parents, a man who grew up in the lap of privilege and opportunity, be driven to such extreme violence? And then there was the confession. That moment, that single conversation with Billy Crystal, hinted at truths Rob had buried deep for decades. Secrets so profound that their revelation now would tear through the public's perception of the Reiner family like a hurricane. Billy Crystal, himself a living legend, would become an unwitting witness to a story few could imagine. And yet, even that moment was only the beginning. This story is not just about murder. It's about secrecy, betrayal, the things we hide from those we claim to love. It's about a family who, on the outside, seemed untouchable, untarnished, invincible even. And it's about the terrifying ways in which the human mind can fracture under pressure, under pain, under secrets long held. What Rob revealed to Billy Crystal, what Nick allegedly did 5 times before the final tragedy, the family histories no one dared speak aloud. All of it converges here, in a story so shocking it almost defies belief. You might be asking yourself, why now? Why is this story surfacing today with such intensity? Because the evidence is mounting, the confessions have been confirmed, and the legal process is unfolding in real time. The world is watching, but more importantly, people are starting to understand that this isn't just another celebrity tragedy. It's a cautionary tale about what can happen when pain, secrecy, and mental instability are allowed to fester in silence. Think about it. Every family has secrets. Some are harmless, some are embarrassing, but some are deadly. And when those secrets involve the people you should trust most, the stakes become unimaginably high. For decades, Rob Reiner shielded the world from the chaos inside his own family. The smiling photos, the appearances on talk shows, the Hollywood accolades, they were all armor, all distraction, all a way to keep the darkness contained. But darkness has a way of finding its way out, and sometimes it leaves devastation in its wake. Nick Reiner allegedly tried to kill a family member not once, not twice, but 5 separate times. Think about that for a moment. 5 attempts. 5 near escapes from tragedy. Each incident, at the time, might have seemed isolated, perhaps dismissed, perhaps quietly hidden from public scrutiny. And yet, when you look at the events in sequence, a horrifying picture emerges, a picture of premeditation, of escalating violence, and of a family desperately trying to survive its own son. How could anyone see the warning signs in time? How could anyone believe that the son of a Hollywood legend could be capable of such acts? And yet, here we are, in the quiet aftermath of a nightmare made real. The Reiner estate, once a symbol of prestige and accomplishment, has become a site of unspeakable tragedy. The neighbors are in shock, Hollywood is in disbelief, and the family's friends are struggling to process a reality they could never have imagined. Amid the headlines, amid the legal filings and the sensationalized reporting, there remains a story that has yet to be fully told. A story that begins with a confession to Billy Crystal, that twists through decades of hidden trauma, and that reaches a crescendo of violence nobody could have foreseen. So what really happened that week? What compelled Rob to finally speak his truth to a trusted friend, knowing the risks, knowing the exposure, knowing that perhaps the revelations would come too late? And how did Nick, living just a few steps away, allegedly escalate to the point of murder? These are questions we will explore in depth, step by step, chapter by chapter. We will examine the family's history, the hidden tensions, the alleged attempts, and the moments of brilliance and tragedy that defined the Reiners' lives. But be warned, this is not an easy story to digest. It will shock you. It will disturb you. It will make you question everything you think you know about trust, about family, and about the thin line between love and destruction. And as we unfold the events, you'll start to see the signs that were there all along, the small moments, the quiet warnings, the glimmers of truth that nobody wanted to face. And here's the most chilling part. Even after all is revealed, even after the confession, even after the arrests, even after the world has witnessed the horror, some questions may never be answered. The true depths of human psychology, the exact motivations behind Nick's alleged actions, the full scope of the family's trauma, these may remain shrouded in mystery. But one thing is certain. What happened in that Brentwood estate is a story that will linger in the public consciousness for years to come, and the ripple effects will be felt far beyond the Reiner family. So as we begin this journey, remember this. Behind every smile, behind every successful career, behind every perfect family, there can be secrets that nobody suspects. Secrets that fester, secrets that build, secrets that, if ignored, can erupt into unimaginable tragedy. Rob Reiner's confession to Billy Crystal was the first public crack in the armor. The events that followed would shatter everything. And as we step into the details, as we recount the attempts, the confessions, the hidden history, and the shocking finale, ask yourself, could this happen in your life? Could the people you love most ever become the source of your deepest fear? They looked perfect. On the red carpet, at awards shows, on glossy magazine covers, smiling, hand in hand, the image of a Hollywood power couple with a son who seemed to have it all. Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner, icons in their own right, had everything most people could dream of: fame, wealth, influence, and a legacy that would be remembered for generations. And yet, appearances can be deadly, because perfection is often just a mask. And behind the smiles and the glamour, something dark was stirring. Imagine living in a house so meticulously designed, so sprawling, that even the smallest flaws seem impossible. The Reiner estate in Brentwood, valued at $13.5 million, was a fortress of beauty. Manicured lawns stretched endlessly. Security cameras watched every corner. The guest house where Nick lived sat quietly, tucked away, as if hiding secrets of its own. From the outside, everything looked serene, controlled, untouchable. But anyone who's lived behind closed doors knows the truth. Money and luxury do not protect you from human frailty, mental instability, or familial strife. Rob Reiner was a man who carried the world on his shoulders. His career spanned decades, from iconic acting roles to groundbreaking directing work, including classics that shaped Hollywood. He was revered for his talent, admired for his intelligence, and loved by peers and fans alike. But what the public rarely saw was the weight of private responsibility, the weight of secrets, of trauma, and of a family under strain. Michelle Reiner, equally accomplished in her own right, had a life dedicated to both her family and her causes. Friends described her as warm, elegant, and fiercely protective of her son. She had the kind of presence that demanded respect, not through force, but through quiet authority and love. Together, the Reiners seemed untouchable, untarnished, untouchably perfect. And then there was Nick, the golden child, the son of a Hollywood legend, raised in privilege and opportunity. From the outside, he had every advantage: education, social connections, and financial security. Yet from the inside, the story was far different. Behind closed doors, whispers of tension, unease, and fear began to emerge. Those closest to the family would later reveal cracks in the polished surface, small incidents, odd behaviors, and moments of alarming intensity that, in retrospect, were warning signs no one could ignore. Some people say that in Hollywood, image is everything. But what happens when the image is shattered? What happens when the reality beneath the smiles is far more complicated, far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined? For the Reiners, this reality was not theoretical, it was all too real. And it had been brewing quietly, patiently, for years. To understand the tragedy that would unfold, we must first understand the family itself. Not the public facade, not the Hollywood storylines, but the real Reiners. A family bound by love and ambition, but also by secrets, unspoken resentments, and tensions that festered over decades. Rob Reiner was known for his warmth, his humor, and his intelligence, but also for the private pressures he carried as a parent in a household marked by high expectations and hidden fractures. Michelle, the stabilizing force, often found herself caught between protecting her family and shielding the world from what was happening behind the walls of their estate. Nick, meanwhile, was both beloved and misunderstood. He had moments of brilliance, charisma, and charm. He could light up a room, make people laugh, and charm even the most critical of observers. But he also had moments of volatility, anger, and a darkness that would later become central to this story. Friends and family, at the time, tried to rationalize these behaviors, blaming stress, mental health struggles, or youthful immaturity. But beneath the surface, patterns were forming. Patterns that would culminate in tragedy. It's easy to look back now and see warning signs. But at the time, no one fully understood what they were seeing. No one could imagine that the young man living just steps away from his parents, inside a home that seemed safe and controlled, could allegedly commit acts of violence that would shock the entire world. And yet, that is precisely what happened. Every family has its tensions. Every household experiences arguments, misunderstandings, and disappointments. But some families carry deeper burdens, traumas that are hidden, unresolved, and toxic. The Reiners were one of those families. And the very same home that had been a symbol of success, of love, and of security would become a stage for unspeakable tragedy. Consider the duality of their existence. The public Reiners, smiling at award shows, attending charity galas, appearing in media interviews. And the private Reiners, navigating a household filled with fear, secrets, and escalating tension. How does a family maintain such a delicate balance? How can love coexist with terror, laughter with fear, and trust with betrayal? These were questions the Reiners would face daily, and for decades, they managed to hide the answers from everyone outside the family. Even their closest friends, those who believed they knew the Reiners intimately, were unaware of the full depth of the tension inside the estate. It wasn't until the tragedy struck, until the world learned of the confession Rob made to Billy Crystal, that anyone could begin to comprehend the forces at play. And even then, the story remained incomplete. Pieces of a puzzle that had been carefully hidden for decades were suddenly scattered across headlines, police reports, and whispered conversations among friends and neighbors. The Brentwood estate itself became more than a home. It became a symbol. Symbol of wealth, of fame, of privilege, but also of vulnerability. Because no amount of security cameras, high walls, or luxury could prevent what was about to unfold. No amount of money could shield the family from the consequences of long-hidden trauma. And no Hollywood legend could rewrite the course of events that were set in motion years before the first murder attempt. As we explore the Reiners story, it's crucial to recognize the tension between perception and reality. On the outside, they were perfect. On the inside, they were human, vulnerable, and ultimately unprepared for the darkness that would descend upon them. Rob's confession, the escalating behavior of Nick, and the tragic night of the murders are all intertwined in a story that is as shocking as it is heartbreaking. And now, with the world watching, we can start to piece together how a family so seemingly flawless could unravel in ways no one could have imagined. We'll examine each chapter of their lives, each warning sign, each hidden trauma, and each shocking revelation. And as we do, you'll start to see how perfection, fame, and privilege can sometimes mask the deepest vulnerabilities, and how the consequences of ignoring those vulnerabilities can be catastrophic. The question is no longer theoretical. The question is personal. Could this happen to any family? Could the people you trust most be the ones hiding secrets that could destroy you? As the story unfolds, we will revisit these questions, challenge your assumptions, and reveal the hidden forces that drove the Reiner family toward a tragedy that stunned the world. And as we close this chapter, remember, the facade of perfection often hides the darkest realities. The Reiners were no exception. And what comes next, the confession, the hidden attempts, the escalating tension, is even more shocking than anyone could have imagined. What do you say when the weight of a lifetime's secrets becomes unbearable? When the walls you've built around yourself no longer contain the storm within? For Rob Reiner, that moment came just a week before his death, and he chose to confide in someone he trusted more than anyone else in Hollywood, Billy Crystal. Imagine being Billy Crystal that day. A man known for laughter, for timing, for lighthearted charm, suddenly faced with the raw vulnerability of a friend whose entire life has been shaped by secrecy and fear. Rob Reiner, the icon, the celebrated filmmaker and actor, sat across from him and spoke words he had never spoken to anyone else. Words that would shock, haunt, and forever alter the understanding of a family that seemed untouchable. The conversation began innocuously, as most friendships between legends do. With jokes, with laughter, with stories of Hollywood past. But soon, the tone shifted. Rob's voice grew quieter. His eyes, usually so full of confidence and warmth, carried a weight that Billy could not ignore. And then, the confession came. A revelation that had been buried for decades, hidden behind smiles, interviews, and the carefully constructed image of the Reiners as a picture-perfect family. Rob revealed the truth about his son, Nick. About the tension that had been building, the fear he had long harbored, and the shocking incidents that no one outside the family could have imagined. He spoke of a darkness that had crept quietly into their lives, of moments that had been dismissed as minor incidents, but which, in retrospect, were warning signs of something far more dangerous. And he admitted, for the first time, how close the family had come to disaster, and how often he had feared for their lives. Billy Crystal listened, stunned. This was not a story of Hollywood drama or celebrity scandal. This was a story of survival, of terror, and of a son whose actions were becoming increasingly unpredictable and violent. Rob's confession painted a chilling picture. Nick had allegedly attempted to harm family members multiple times, a fact Rob had kept secret to protect the family's public image. Each incident had been a brush with disaster, a warning shot that could not be ignored. What makes this confession even more shocking is the timing. Just 1 week before Rob and Michelle were murdered, Rob chose to speak the truth to Billy Crystal. Why? Perhaps he sensed the danger escalating. Perhaps he needed to unburden himself. Or perhaps he wanted someone outside the family to understand the threat he could no longer control. Whatever the reason, that conversation was the first public crack in the Reiner family's carefully maintained facade. A crack that would widen with devastating consequences. The details Rob shared were horrifying. He recounted the escalating behavior of Nick, the threats that had been ignored or rationalized, and the subtle signs that something was gravely wrong. He spoke of sleepless nights, of anxiety that had been masked with charm and humor, and of the constant vigilance required to protect those he loved. Each anecdote was more alarming than the last, each revelation more terrifying, until the full scope of the situation became undeniable. The Reiners were living in a household where the threat of violence was real, imminent, and increasingly likely to manifest. Billy Crystal, ever the professional and friend, was faced with a choice. He could offer support, he could listen, but he could not act as law enforcement. And yet, he understood the gravity of what Rob was telling him. These were not casual concerns, not mere disagreements, not the typical tensions of family life. This was a man confessing that his own son had crossed lines that could lead to tragedy, that danger was escalating, and that time was running out. Rob also revealed something more personal, a sense of helplessness. Despite his wealth, his influence, and his fame, he felt powerless against the threat posed by his own child. The conversations he had had with Nick, the interventions he had attempted, the private precautions he had taken, none seemed sufficient. And in sharing this with Billy Crystal, Rob was admitting not only the danger, but also the profound failure he felt as a parent. As we explore this confession, it's important to understand the stakes. Rob Reiner was not a man prone to exaggeration. He was intelligent, articulate, and precise. When he spoke, it carried weight. And the weight of this particular confession cannot be overstated. He was revealing a family secret that, if known publicly, could devastate reputations, careers, and lives. And yet, he chose to speak it anyway, because he recognized the danger could no longer be contained. The confession also serves as a key lens through which to understand the tragedy that followed. It provides context for Nick's alleged actions, illuminates the family dynamics that had been carefully hidden from the world, and sets the stage for the escalating events that would culminate in the murder of Rob and Michelle. Without this moment, without this glimpse into the private fears and revelations of Rob Reiner, the story risks being misinterpreted as a simple case of violent crime rather than the culmination of decades of hidden trauma, tension, and warning signs ignored or dismissed. Think about it. Rob Reiner, a man with access to the best mental health professionals, the finest support systems, and nearly limitless resources, felt trapped. Trapped by his love for his son, by the need to protect his family, and by the impossible task of managing a threat he could not predict or control. And yet, despite his awareness and efforts, he could not prevent the inevitable. This confession, this intimate moment with Billy Crystal, reveals the human side of a tragedy often obscured by headlines. The desperation, the fear, and the impossibility of fully protecting those you love from the darkness within someone you trust most. It is here, in this confession, that we begin to see the first cracks in the narrative the public had been presented. The perfect Hollywood family, the golden son, the picture of success and charm. These were no longer sufficient to explain the unfolding horror. The confession introduces the complexity of human behavior, the fragility of familial bonds, and the terrifying consequences of ignoring signs that something is deeply wrong. Rob's admission to Billy Crystal also carries a haunting foreshadowing. He spoke in a way that suggested he knew something irreversible was approaching. It was not casual speculation. It was the sober recognition of a threat that had grown beyond his control. And in hindsight, that recognition was tragically prescient. Just days later, the Reiner family would face the ultimate manifestation of the danger Rob had described, and the world would finally see the consequences of years of hidden tension and unspoken trauma. As we reflect on this confession, consider the broader implications. What does it mean to know that someone you love is capable of extreme violence? How do you balance the instinct to protect, the hope for change, and the fear that the worst is yet to come? These are questions that no parent should ever have to answer, but they are questions that defined Rob Reiner's final days. And as the confession ends, as the conversation with Billy Crystal concludes, one fact becomes undeniably clear. The warning signs had been there, the danger had been articulated, and yet the tragedy was still inevitable. What happened in the days following this conversation would shock the world, challenge assumptions about family, fame, and human behavior, and set in motion a sequence of events that would leave the Reiner name forever entwined with both brilliance and horror. The story of Nick Reiner is a story that begins with privilege but twists into a dark and troubling path. On the surface, Nick had everything a young man could want. The love of his parents, wealth, opportunity, and access to the elite circles of Hollywood. But beneath that surface, a storm was quietly gathering, one that would eventually engulf his family in tragedy. From an early age, Nick showed signs of brilliance and charisma. He could charm adults, engage with peers, and command attention with ease. Friends and family often described him as energetic, intelligent, and ambitious. He was the kind of child every parent dreams of. Gifted, capable, and seemingly destined for success. But as he grew older, cracks began to appear. Small incidents, brief eruptions of anger, moments of intense frustration, subtle defiance, were often dismissed by those around him. After all, in a household surrounded by fame, money, and influence, unusual behavior could easily be rationalized as youthful exuberance or the pressures of growing up in the spotlight. However, Nick's behavior was more than typical adolescent rebellion. As he entered his teens, his temper and impulses became increasingly difficult to manage. Friends noted sudden mood swings, episodes of paranoia, and moments of irrational aggression. Teachers, counselors, and extended family members occasionally raised concerns, but these observations were often shrugged off or explained away as the quirks of a privileged upbringing. One recurring pattern in Nick's past was a tendency towards secrecy and manipulation. He learned early how to conceal his true feelings and intentions, presenting a charming, likable exterior while harboring deeper resentment and anger. It was a survival tactic, a way to navigate a household where perfection was expected and mistakes were often hidden. But this duality would become a dangerous hallmark of his personality, enabling him to escalate toward behaviors that would later terrify those closest to him. By his early 20s, Nick's volatility had become more pronounced. Friends noticed moments of obsession when a minor disappointment could trigger a disproportionate response. Family members began to witness the emergence of controlling and manipulative tendencies, often veiled behind the veneer of charm and humor. Nick's mental health, though never formally diagnosed in public records, seemed to be unraveling under the weight of unresolved trauma, unmet needs, and the pressures of living in the shadow of fame. Adding to the complexity was the dynamic between Nick and his parents. Rob and Michelle, while loving and supportive, maintained high expectations and an emphasis on appearance and achievement. The very qualities that had helped build a successful family also created pressure for Nick to conform to an image he may have struggled to embrace. Moments of rebellion, defiance, or perceived failure were magnified by the constant awareness of public scrutiny. This tension, love mixed with expectation, fueled an undercurrent of resentment and frustration that Nick carried into adulthood. As Nick entered his 30s, these patterns escalated. Reports from close sources later revealed incidents of aggression, threats, and manipulative behavior within the household. Some incidents were minor, others frightening, but all contributed to a growing sense of unease and danger. Friends who visited the Reiner estate described a palpable tension, a sense that behind the polished doors, the family was struggling to contain something they could not fully control. Mental health experts who later reviewed the case noted that Nick exhibited classic warning signs of escalating risk, patterns of impulsivity, difficulty managing anger, paranoia, and a history of strained relationships with family members. These behaviors, when combined with access to wealth, privacy, and a lack of outside accountability, created a volatile situation. What might have been managed with intervention earlier in life became a powder keg, ready to explode. Despite these red flags, Nick's public image remained largely intact. To the outside world, he was the son of Hollywood royalty, successful and composed. He appeared in public photos smiling with his parents, attending events, and living in a luxurious guest house on the family estate. But appearances, as we've seen, can be deceiving. The true story, one of fear, manipulation, and escalating danger, remained hidden from the public eye. One of the most troubling aspects of Nick's past is that the warning signs were often subtle but repeated. Family members and insiders who looked back could see patterns. Moments when Nick threatened, moments when he lashed out, moments when he displayed behaviors that should have triggered intervention. Each incident, considered alone, might have been dismissed, but taken together, they formed a clear trajectory toward escalating violence. And tragically, no decisive action was taken before the situation reached a catastrophic point. Another key element in Nick's past was his relationship with his parents. While Rob and Michelle were devoted, they were also cautious, protective, and, in some ways, constrained by the fear of public scandal. This created a complex environment where Nick could act out without immediate consequence, where his threats and manipulations could go unchecked. The family dynamic, though rooted in love, became a breeding ground for tension, resentment, and fear. And then there was the escalation. Reports later indicated that Nick allegedly attempted to harm family members not once, but multiple times. Each attempt was a a step toward the eventual tragedy. And each time, the family, friends, relatives, and even mental health professionals was forced to navigate a delicate balance between intervention and protection of their privacy, their reputation, and their safety. By the time Nick reached his early 30s, the signs were undeniable. He was no longer a troubled young adult. He was a danger, a man whose internal struggles had manifested in behaviors that threatened the very people who had given him life. The pressure, the secrecy, and the lack of effective intervention converged to create a situation that, tragically, no one could fully control. As we look back at Nick's troubled past, it becomes clear that the seeds of tragedy were planted long before the fatal events at the Brentwood estate. Childhood patterns of secrecy and manipulation, teenage struggles with impulse and emotion, and adult behaviors marked by aggression and unpredictability all combined to create a perfect storm. The Reiners, despite their love and efforts, were unable to prevent the escalation. And in this chapter, we begin to see the contours of a story that moves from troubling past to shocking present. The path from privilege to peril is never simple. And in Nick Reiner's case, the signs were there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the fateful day when everything would collide. The trajectory from troubled past to alleged attempts on the lives of his family is chilling, and it sets the stage for the events that followed. 5 times. That's the number reported in the accounts surrounding Nick Reiner's alleged attempts to harm his family. 5 separate incidents, each more chilling than the last, each a step closer to the unthinkable tragedy that would finally strike the Brentwood estate. To understand how a family could go from daily life to horror, we need to examine these alleged attempts, how they unfolded, how they were perceived at the time, and how they were ultimately ignored, minimized, or misunderstood. The first alleged attempt, according to sources close to the family, was subtle but alarming. It didn't involve blood or visible injury, but the intent was clear to those who later recounted the events. Nick, in a moment of rage, allegedly cornered a family member and made threats that carried an undercurrent of lethal intent. At the time, it was brushed off as a heated argument, a youthful overreaction. But in hindsight, it was the first signal that Nick's volatility was dangerous, not just dramatic. The second attempt escalated. Reports suggest that Nick allegedly used objects in the household in a way that could have caused serious harm. Again, no one was physically injured, and the incidents were quickly contained, but the pattern was now emerging. Those who observed these behaviors privately expressed concern, but fear of public scandal and a desire to protect the family's image prevented decisive intervention. It's a tragic irony that the very effort to preserve safety and reputation may have contributed to the escalation. By the third alleged attempt, the situation was more overt. Nick allegedly engaged in threatening actions that forced a family member to take immediate precautions. Doors were locked, private security measures were reinforced, and discussions behind closed doors began to focus on the reality of a dangerous pattern. Still, there was hesitation. Love and disbelief can paralyze judgment, particularly when the individual in question is a son, a family member, and someone who, in public, seemed perfectly normal. The fourth attempt introduced an element of planning. According to sources, Nick allegedly exhibited deliberate behavior, choosing moments when family members were vulnerable or isolated. These were not impulsive outbursts like those in earlier incidents. These were calculated, escalating threats. And yet, outside observers, friends, neighbors, even some extended family, remained unaware. Only those closest to the household truly grasped the danger, and even they were constrained by the difficulty of acting decisively without exposing themselves or the family to public scrutiny. The fifth alleged attempt, tragically, was the precursor to the final, fatal act. It was reportedly the most serious, involving direct physical aggression. It's unclear whether the attempt was fully executed or stopped at the last moment, but the intensity and immediacy of the threat forced a reckoning. Rob and Michelle, the parents, faced the terrifying reality that their son, who had been charming, intelligent, and seemingly under control for so long, could, and had, become a genuine threat to their lives. Understanding these alleged attempts is critical to understanding the tragedy that unfolded. They reveal a pattern, a trajectory of escalation, and a repeated inability of the system, both familial and societal, to intervene effectively. Each incident was a warning, a chance to prevent the ultimate catastrophe. But love, fear, disbelief, and the complexities of family loyalty combined to allow the danger to persist. What makes these events particularly chilling is how ordinary they appeared at the time. Each alleged attempt was, superficially, something that could be explained away. A heated argument, a moment of frustration, an overreaction, but patterns, especially repeated ones, tell a story that isolated incidents cannot. And in the case of Nick Reiner, the pattern was clear: escalation, intent, and increasing danger. Psychologists and behavioral experts often point to repetition as one of the most reliable indicators of future risk. In other words, when someone exhibits aggressive or threatening behavior multiple times, it is statistically more likely that they may act violently in the future. And in Nick's case, the pattern was undeniable. The family, despite their best efforts, was facing a situation that had moved beyond normal intervention methods. The risk was now acute, and the potential for tragedy had become terrifyingly real. Another element that emerges from the reports is the psychological tension within the family. Living under the shadow of repeated threats creates a constant state of fear and hypervigilance. Rob and Michelle reportedly became increasingly anxious, aware that their son's behavior was escalating but unsure of how to stop it without causing irreparable damage to the family. This kind of sustained stress has profound effects on anyone, even those with substantial resources and influence. It's a psychological pressure cooker, one that, tragically, exploded in the worst possible way. And yet, there's a human element that cannot be ignored: denial. Even in the face of repeated threats, it is difficult to believe that someone you love, someone who grew up under your care, could become a mortal danger. Parents often rationalize, justify, or downplay alarming behaviors in their children, hoping it's a phase, a momentary lapse, or a stress-induced reaction. But as the fifth alleged attempt shows, rationalization can have deadly consequences. To this day, the exact details of these 5 alleged attempts remain murky, shielded by legal proceedings, family privacy, and the limitations of public reporting. But the pattern is clear, the warning signs are unmistakable, and the trajectory toward the final tragedy is chillingly evident. These incidents were not isolated. They were steps on a path that led inexorably to the fatal events at the Brentwood estate. Each attempt also underscores the tragedy of missed opportunities. Intervention, counseling, or external support might have altered the trajectory, might have prevented the escalation, might have saved lives. But in families, as in life, opportunities are fleeting. Decisions are clouded by emotion, fear, and love. And in this case, those factors combine to allow a tragedy that might have been preventable. As we reflect on these alleged attempts, it's impossible not to feel a mixture of horror and empathy. Horror at the violence and danger, and empathy for a family caught between love and fear, trying desperately to navigate a situation that no one could fully control. The Reiners, despite fame, wealth, and access to resources, were not immune to human fragility and vulnerability. And so, as the story moves forward, we see the culmination of these 5 incidents. Each one was a warning, each one was a chance to act, and each one, tragically, was ignored or minimized, setting the stage for the events that would shock the world. $13.5 million. Sprawling lawns. Privacy walls taller than most houses. Security cameras watching every corner. The Brentwood estate where Rob and Michelle Reiner lived was more than a home. It was a fortress, a symbol of success, and a stage on which one of the most shocking family tragedies in recent Hollywood history would unfold. To an outsider, the estate was perfection. Every detail was meticulously curated. The main house gleamed with elegance. The guest house, where Nick lived, was tucked into a quiet corner, almost invisible from the street. Gardens bloomed in neat patterns. Every inch of the property seemed designed to project calm, wealth, and control. But appearances, as the Reiner family would tragically learn, can be deceiving. Homes tell stories, often without words. In this estate, the story was one of contrast, beauty and terror coexisting in uneasy harmony. Rob and Michelle had created a safe haven, or at least a semblance of one. But safety is not guaranteed by walls or cameras or price tags. Within these walls, a family's deepest fears and darkest secrets simmered, hidden from the public, hidden even from neighbors who only saw the curated surface. The main house itself was expansive. Each room exuded luxury, from polished hardwood floors to high ceilings that seemed to stretch endlessly. The decor reflected years of taste and refinement, but it also reflected a desire to control, to shape an environment in which danger seemed impossible. Yet no matter how many cameras were installed, no matter how many locks or alarms, the greatest threat to the family was not external. It was inside. The guest house, where Nick lived, was quiet, unassuming, and in many ways isolated. It was a place of privacy, a sanctuary, or perhaps a cage, depending on perspective. Its separation from the main house created both independence and distance, a dynamic that would later play a key role in the tragic events. The proximity of Nick to his parents, combined with his escalating instability, created a ticking time bomb, a threat that, despite the estate's security, could not be contained. Neighbors often described the Reiner estate as serene, almost too perfect, lawns trimmed to precise angles, hedges that looked sculpted by professionals, entryways guarded by security systems and cameras. And yet, the silence was deceptive. Behind the gates, within the walls, tension and fear were growing. The estate, for all its beauty, had become a stage where the family's internal drama unfolded in secret, invisible to the world. The layout of the property itself played a role in the tragedy. The guest house was close enough that Nick could easily access the main house, yet far enough to maintain a sense of separation. Paths between buildings, strategically landscaped, allowed privacy but also obscured movement. Security cameras could monitor entrances and driveways, but not necessarily the interactions that happened inside. The design of the estate, meant to protect, ironically created blind spots where danger could quietly build. Inside, the house reflected both wealth and history. Rooms were filled with memories, photographs, and trophies of success. But these symbols of accomplishment also carried weight, expectations, pressures, and unspoken rules about appearances and behavior. The estate, in this sense, was more than a building. It was a living character in the story, a silent witness to the tensions that would escalate into violence. The Reiners' choice to live in Brentwood, a neighborhood synonymous with affluence and celebrity, added another layer. On the one hand, the location offered security, privacy, and prestige. On the other, it amplified the pressures of living under scrutiny, of maintaining appearances, of hiding family issues from a world eager for scandal. In a sense, the very factors that made the estate desirable also made it a pressure cooker for secrets, fear, and eventually, tragedy. What's haunting about the estate is how ordinary it seemed to outsiders. From the street, it could have been any luxury home. Passers-by could not know what was happening inside, could not sense the tension, the fear, or the escalation of danger. And yet, inside, the family lived in a state of heightened alert, aware that Nick's instability posed a growing threat. Security measures, private precautions, and hidden interventions could only do so much. The most dangerous elements, emotion, fear, and human unpredictability, cannot be contained by walls or gates. The estate's role in the tragedy is inseparable from the story itself. It provided both a shield and a stage. It allowed privacy, yet it contained danger. It symbolized success, yet it hid instability. Every corner of the property, from the polished main house to the quiet guest house, became part of the narrative. And on the fateful night, it would witness horror that no amount of luxury, planning, or security could prevent. Understanding the estate is also essential to understanding the dynamics of the Reiner family. The physical distance between the main house and the guest house, the enclosed spaces, and the private pathways all shaped interactions. They created opportunities for isolation, secrecy, and confrontation. And in the context of Nick's alleged instability, these structural details were far from incidental. They were part of the environment in which the tragedy became possible. Even after the events, investigators and neighbors reflected on the estate with a mix of awe and disbelief. How could such beauty hide such horror? How could a house that seemed designed for safety become the site of unspeakable violence? The answers lie in the intersection of human behavior and environment. No estate, no matter how fortified, can fully contain a family's inner turmoil, especially when the turmoil has been allowed to fester for years. And so, the Brentwood estate stands as both a monument and a warning. It is a symbol of wealth, power, and image, but also a reminder that danger often lies where we least expect it. The beauty of the estate, the perfection of the grounds, and the sophistication of its design all contrasted with the chaos brewing inside. And on the night that changed everything, every detail of that property, from the quiet pathways to the guesthouse doors, played a role in a tragedy that would shock the world. Sunday evening, a night that began like any other, but would end in horror. The Reiner estate, pristine and silent under the California sky, became the stage for a tragedy that would shock the world and forever stain a family name. Rob, 78, and Michelle, 70, had no way of knowing that the evening would end in violence, fear, and death. From the outside, the night appeared calm. The estate glimmered under soft lighting. Security cameras captured shadows moving across manicured lawns. Neighbors, unaware of the danger, saw nothing unusual. But inside the walls of the main house, tension hung in the air like a storm about to break. Years of hidden conflict, fear, and escalating instability were about to erupt in the most tragic way possible. Nick Reiner, 32, living in the guest house just steps away, had reportedly been exhibiting signs of agitation throughout the day. According to sources, the atmosphere in the household had been tense for weeks, with underlying conflicts that had yet to be fully addressed. Rob and Michelle, seasoned, intelligent, and cautious, were acutely aware of the dangers posed by Nick's behavior. But the level of threat on this particular evening would prove impossible to contain. It is believed that the confrontation began in the main house, though exact details remain under investigation. What is clear is that the violence was sudden, brutal, and deadly. Rob and Michelle were found stabbed in their home, a shocking scene that would later be described by law enforcement as one of the most harrowing domestic crime scenes in recent memory. The weapon, method, and ferocity of the attack underscored the intensity of the event and the chilling reality of what had unfolded. The timeline that night is critical. In the hours leading up to the murders, neighbors reported hearing nothing out of the ordinary. The quiet of the estate masked the violence within. This silence, combined with the estate's privacy and layout, allowed the tragedy to unfold without immediate detection. The combination of seclusion and proximity, the main house and guest house being only steps apart, created a setting in which escalation could occur rapidly, with devastating consequences. First responders arrived after a call was made to emergency services, but by the time law enforcement reached the scene, Rob and Michelle were dead. The investigation quickly turned to the only individual living on the property besides the victims, Nick Reiner. He was taken into custody that very night and subsequently charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The swiftness of the arrest reflected both the evidence at the scene and the understanding by authorities that the threat was concentrated and contained within the family home. The brutality of the attack, combined with Nick's prior history and the alleged attempts, painted a terrifying picture of escalation. What had begun as verbal threats and manipulations over the years had culminated in the ultimate act of violence. For law enforcement, the case presented both clarity and complexity. The suspect was known, the victims were known, but the underlying motives, mental state, and precise chain of events were more complicated than any ordinary murder investigation. Friends and neighbors struggled to comprehend the tragedy. How could the Reiners, a family of fame, influence, and apparent stability, fall victim to violence from their own son? How could a home designed for safety and privacy fail to protect the very people who had built it? These questions reverberated throughout the community, the media, and the world, revealing the shocking disconnect between appearances and reality. Inside the estate, investigators pieced together the scene. The evidence suggested premeditation, given the prior alleged attempts and the calculated nature of the attack. But it also raised questions about the psychological state of Nick. Was this a moment of uncontrollable rage, a culmination of years of instability, or something deeper and more sinister? The answers would take months to emerge through legal proceedings, interviews, and forensic analysis. The media coverage of the event amplified the horror. Headlines screamed of murder, betrayal, and tragedy. Social media erupted with speculation, theories, and shock. Friends in Hollywood expressed disbelief and sorrow, recounting the kindness, talent, and generosity of Rob and Michelle. The juxtaposition of their public image with the reality of their deaths created a powerful narrative. Fame and fortune could not shield anyone from the dangers lurking within the private sphere of family. Law enforcement reports indicated that Nick had multiple interactions with family members over the years that hinted at the escalating danger. These interactions, when considered in retrospect, painted a chilling portrait. A young man struggling with unresolved trauma and mental instability, repeatedly crossing lines that should have been addressed long before that Sunday evening. The night of the murders was the devastating culmination of patterns that had gone unheeded for far too long. The emotional weight of the tragedy was immense. Rob and Michelle were not just public figures. They were parents, friends, and pillars of their community. The loss reverberated across Hollywood and beyond. And for those following the story closely, the question was unavoidable. Could this have been prevented? Could intervention, therapy, or external support have altered the course of events? The answer, sadly, remains speculative, but the repeated alleged attempts provide a tragic context. Warnings had been issued, but circumstances, fear, and familial loyalty delayed action until it was too late. The night of the murders also raised questions about the legal and ethical complexities of family intervention. How does one balance protection, love, and the rights of a child, especially when that child exhibits violent tendencies? How can a family navigate the tension between privacy and safety, image and reality? These questions, while theoretical in most households, became a matter of life and death for the Reiners. As the first responders left the scene, the estate transformed from a place of beauty and privacy to a crime scene that would be scrutinized by investigators, media, and the public for months to come. Every corner of the property, from the main house to the guest house, became part of a narrative that combined glamour, horror, and human tragedy. The quiet that once protected the family had failed, leaving only shock, grief, and unanswered questions. And as the investigation progressed, one truth became painfully clear. The Reiners' tragedy was not a sudden event in isolation. It was the result of years of escalating tension, ignored warnings, and the complex, often hidden dynamics of family life. The night of the murders was the apex of a long, dark trajectory. A trajectory shaped by fear, secrecy, and the unpredictable nature of human behavior. The morning after the murders, the Reiner estate was a crime scene. Police tape cordoned off the sprawling property. Reporters and neighbors gathered, drawn by the shocking news. Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner, a family long seen as untouchable, had been brutally killed in their own home. The weight of the tragedy was heavy, and the investigation that followed would uncover chilling details, turning speculation into a stark reality. From the start, law enforcement focused on the most immediate and obvious suspect, Nick Reiner. Living on the property, in the guest house just steps away from the main house, he was in proximity to the crime in a way no one else could be. While authorities initially approached the case with procedural caution, the combination of evidence at the scene, witness accounts, and prior patterns of behavior made Nick the focal point of the investigation. The process of investigating the Reiner estate was meticulous. Forensic teams combed the property for evidence: fingerprints, DNA, blood spatter, and digital footprints. Every room was examined, every pathway documented. Security cameras were reviewed repeatedly, capturing angles, movements, and timing. Investigators sought to reconstruct the events leading up to the murders, to understand the escalation from alleged prior threats to the ultimate act of violence. Nick's arrest was swift, occurring the same night the bodies were discovered. Law enforcement officials cited both the circumstantial and forensic evidence in their decision to charge him with 2 counts of first-degree murder. In the eyes of the law, the proximity, prior history, and nature of the crime established probable cause. The arrest was both shocking and, in retrospect, almost inevitable. From a legal perspective, the charges of first-degree murder carry significant implications. They reflect an assessment of premeditation, intent, and malice. This was not a case of sudden rage or accidental violence. The authorities believed there was planning and deliberate action involved. The rapid filing of charges demonstrated both the seriousness of the crime and the clarity of the evidence linking Nick to the murders. The public reaction was immediate and intense. News outlets exploded with coverage. Social media was flooded with speculation, condemnation, and disbelief. Fans and friends of Rob and Michelle Reiner struggled to reconcile the image of a loving, accomplished family with the reality of the crime. Hollywood insiders spoke of shock, horror, and sorrow. The arrest of Nick Reiner became front-page news, sparking debates about mental health, family dynamics, and the pressures of living in the shadow of fame. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered more details about the alleged prior attempts on family members. These incidents, previously hidden from public view, now became central to understanding the motive, the risk, and the potential trajectory that led to the murders. Patterns of escalation, repeated threats, and episodes of violence suggested that the tragedy was not a spontaneous event, but the culmination of long-standing issues within the household. Interviews with neighbors revealed a community in shock. Many described the Reiner family as kind, approachable, and private. Few had any sense of the tension within the estate. Others, however, hinted at the occasional strange behavior, moments when Nick seemed distant or agitated. These anecdotes, when pieced together, created a chilling picture of a family quietly struggling with an escalating internal threat that would eventually manifest in fatal violence. Mental health experts commenting on the case noted the dangerous combination of access, isolation, and unresolved trauma. Nick had the means, opportunity, and history of aggression that increased the risk of severe outcomes. While the full psychological profile would take time to compile, early analyses suggested a trajectory of escalating instability, culminating in the tragic events that had stunned the world. The arrest also raised complex questions about the role of family, accountability, and intervention. Could earlier action have prevented the murders? What responsibilities do parents bear when faced with escalating threats from a child? How do wealth, privacy, and fame complicate the ability to seek outside help? The case became not only a criminal investigation, but also a lens through which to examine these difficult, often uncomfortable questions about family dynamics, mental health, and societal responsibility. During the initial police interviews, Nick reportedly provided statements that investigators are still analyzing. While much remains under legal seal, the authorities indicated that the evidence connecting him to the murders was compelling. This combination of direct evidence, prior history, and forensic findings solidified the case against him, while simultaneously leaving many questions unanswered, questions about motive, mental state, and the exact sequence of events. Public fascination with the case only intensified as details emerged. News outlets dissected every angle, social media users speculated about motives, and fans grappled with the cognitive dissonance of reconciling Nick's image with the alleged acts. The narrative of the Reiner family, previously one of success and Hollywood glamour, was now intertwined with fear, betrayal, and horror. Legally, the investigation moved quickly to secure evidence and begin the process of prosecution. Warrants were issued, forensic analyses conducted, and interviews carried out with those closest to the family. Each piece of evidence added to a growing narrative of escalating risk, long-standing familial tension, and the tragic inevitability of the murders once preventive action had failed. But beyond the legal and procedural details lies the human story. Rob and Michelle were gone. Friends, colleagues, and extended family were left to grapple with grief, confusion, and disbelief. The arrest of Nick, while necessary from a law enforcement perspective, added layers of complexity: love, loyalty, fear, and the horrifying reality of losing parents at the hands of their own child. This chapter of the Reiner story is crucial because it bridges the gap between what was hidden for decades and the reality of the crime. The investigation and arrest made public what had previously only been whispered or observed in private. Patterns of danger, escalation, and a family living under the shadow of an imminent threat. And as authorities moved forward with the investigation, preparing for prosecution and further analysis, the world began to understand that this was more than a shocking headline. This was a story of family, trauma, and tragedy that had been decades in the making. A story that would continue to unfold, revealing more twists, secrets, and heartbreaks with each passing day. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming.